You've probably heard of the Great Depression, but I'm willing to bet the story you think, that it was all because of the 1929 stock market crash, isn't the whole story. It's not even close. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain and uncover the real reasons a market crash spiraled into a decade of global misery. And it's a story all about failed institutions and a few absolutely disastrous decisions. So first, let's set the scene. It's the 1920s, the Great War is finally over, and America is just roaring. It's the jazz age. You've got parties and this explosion of consumerism. I mean, thanks to new tech like Henry Ford's assembly line, things like cars and radios were suddenly affordable for everyday people. And to make it all happen, banks were handing out credit like it was candy. Life felt good, and on Wall Street, well, it felt even better. The stock market just went on an absolute tear. Get this, it increased sixfold in only 8 years. It really seemed like a can't-lose game. And as regular folks heard these stories of people getting rich quick, it created a snowball effect. Everybody wanted in, from the biggest tycoons to the factory workers, and they were pouring their life savings into the market. Now, what was pouring gasoline on this fire? It was a practice called buying on margin. It's basically a fancy way of saying you're taking out a loan to buy stocks. This let people buy way more shares than they could actually afford, which just fueled the bubble even more. By 1929, an incredible 40% of all consumer debt in the entire country was being used just to speculate on stocks. This quote from President Hoover just perfectly captures the mood. In 1929, it seriously felt like the party would never end, that poverty itself was about to become a thing of the past. But behind the scenes, the actual economy was already starting to slow down. The stock market had become completely detached from reality. And then, catastrophe. It all started on October 24th, Black Thursday, when the market suddenly dropped 11%. You could feel the panic start to set in. But then the following Tuesday, Black Tuesday, was even worse, a 12% plunge as everyone desperately rushed for the exits. In just 2 weeks, about a third of the market's entire value had just vanished. Poof! Fortunes and life savings gone overnight. And right here, this is where most people think the story ends. The crash happened, so the Great Depression began. Simple, right? But that's not what happened. The crash was the spark, for sure, but it wasn't the massive fire that burned the world's economy for an entire decade. So what was? The crash absolutely triggered a recession. No doubt about it. But what turned a nasty recession into the Great Depression were two colossal institutional failures. Let's break down the first one. The first domino to fall was the American banking system itself. See, back in the 1920s, it wasn't this stable thing we think of today. It was more like a fragile house of cards, just waiting for a strong gust of wind. So why were the banks so weak? Well, for one, a lot of them had recklessly invested their own money in the stock market. They'd also made tons of those risky margin loans we talked about. And here's the absolute kicker. There was no deposit insurance. If your bank went under, your savings were just gone. Forever. So after the crash, you can imagine the panic. People started hearing rumors about banks failing, so they did the logical thing. They ran to their own banks to pull their cash out. But here's the thing about banks. They don't just keep all your money in a big vault. They lend it out. So even a perfectly healthy bank can't survive if everyone demands their cash all at once. This chain reaction is called a bank run, and it toppled banks all across the country. The scale of this collapse is just hard to wrap your head around. Over 9,000 banks failed. Think about that for a second. 9,000. And with them, 9 million individual savings accounts were completely wiped out. The trust in the entire financial system was just shattered. But believe it or not, the bank failures were only half of the story. And this brings us to the second and maybe even more critical failure, the complete inaction of the one institution that was created to prevent this exact kind of collapse, the Federal Reserve. As banks were failing and people started hiding cash under their mattresses, the total amount of money actually circulating in the economy just plummeted. It fell by nearly a third in just 4 years. And the Federal Reserve, the one group with the power to pump money back in and stop the bleeding, did nothing. They were so afraid of inflation and so committed to the gold standard that they just stood by and watched the money supply collapse. It was a truly catastrophic mistake. This shrinking money supply created a terrible economic poison, deflation. Think of it this way. When prices are falling, why would you spend or invest any money today if you know it'll be worth more tomorrow? You wouldn't.
So nobody spends, businesses get crushed, wages fall, and any debt you have becomes impossible to pay back. The entire economy just ground to a halt.
So, we have these huge, high-level financial failures. But what did that actually mean for ordinary people? It meant their lives were plunged into a decade of absolute despair. By 1933, the unemployment rate hit an unbelievable 24.9%. Let that sink in. 1 out of every 4 American workers had no job, no income, nothing. Millions upon millions of families were left with absolutely nothing to fall back on. The country itself just looked different. You had breadlines that stretched for entire city blocks. Homeless families were forced to build shanty towns, which they bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles. And as if things couldn't possibly get any worse, a horrific environmental disaster, the Dust Bowl, tore through the nation's heartland. But out of all this catastrophe, we did learn some incredibly crucial lessons. The failures of the 1930s actually led directly to reforms that built a much, much safer financial system for all of us. You can really draw a straight line from the problems to the solutions. To stop those terrifying bank runs, we created the FDIC to ensure our deposits. To police all that risky stock market behavior, we established the SEC. And to create a basic safety net for the poor and the elderly, the Social Security program was born. These are pillars of our economy today, and they came directly from this crisis. So what's the real lesson here? The Great Depression wasn't just a stock market crash. It was a profound failure of our institutions, of banks that were allowed to be too reckless, and a central bank that failed to do its job. It teaches us that these cycles of greed and bubbles are a recurring theme throughout history, which leaves us with one last big question. Knowing everything we know now, could it happen again?